Does the WSL have an identity crisis? Now, this is something I've been thinking of for the last 10 years. So I'll say it's 2014 slash 2015. And my reasoning for that is the likes of Manchester City and Chelsea and later Manchester United all coming into the forefront of the women's game. Now, those type of clubs coming into the forefront, it's not a bad thing, but when you factor in what the WSL was in its early years and before the WSL, you start to think, is the women's league losing its identity? Now, first of all, let's look at the teams. Like in the pre-WSL era, the era that I was following before women's football was a thing on TV, I knew that the likes of Arsenal being at the top like every season, and towards the end of the 2000s to the early 2010s, there was Everton and later Birmingham City. They were at the top. Well, not at the top, but challenging the top as well. I think Liverpool, they did well, winning back-to-back titles, but unfortunately they fell away. They're back now, which is good to see. Sticking with the teams, does anyone else recall Fulham in the early 2000s? So they were probably the best challengers to Arsenal around that period, but if you've been following women's football for a long time, then you know the unfortunate thing that happened with them. They were the first team to go professional, but then they were reverted to semi-professional status, which was sad to see. So that's that for now. Next up, rivalries. Now, going back to the pre-WSL era, there were rivalries such as Arsenal versus Fulham, which was from the early 2000s, and then there was Arsenal Charlton Athletic for a bit, and then towards the end of the 2000s slash start 2010s, that was the Arsenal Everton rivalry, which at the time Everton were the closest challengers to Arsenal, winning the League Cup in 2008 and the FA Cup just 2 years later. And then we come to the 2010s, between 2010 and 2012, the rivalry was Arsenal versus Birmingham City, with City winning their first ever piece of major silverware in 2012 and reaching their first European semi-final in 2014, which they knocked Arsenal out of the quarterfinals, which is their biggest result to date, or arguably their biggest result to date. Well, unless you're factoring in Birmingham City beating Arsenal in 2022, which is something I still haven't gotten over, but there we go. But anyway, rivalries. Before WSL, we had unique rivalries, which we didn't see in the men's game, but over the last 10 years, we've started to see rivalries from the men's game being brought over to the women's game. Say like Chelsea Arsenal, or Chelsea Manchester City, or Arsenal versus Tottenham, or even the Manchester derby, which I don't think is a real derby. But anyway, we're starting to see things that are happening in the men's game coming over to the women's game, and I just think to myself that maybe the WSL is starting to have a bit of an identity crisis, and for me, it's one of the reasons why I prefer the NWSL, because the league actually has its own identity. Now, if we look at the league as a whole, looking at the top six, it's exactly the same as the top six in the men's game. And the wider aspect of the league the 12 sides in total, all of them have Premier League sides, which I think just tells me that the women's game is morphing into the men's game, and that cannot be a good thing. Like, we're seeing this not just in England, but in Europe as well. Like, with the likes of Real Madrid having a women's team, but a Barcelona women's team has come into the forefront over the last, say, 5-6 years about. And we've seen the likes of Juventus having a women's team in the last half decade. Like, for me, it just shows that, is women's football really women's football, or are they just taking whatever is in the men's game? And I understand that the women's game has to grow, but as someone who's been following the women's game for a long time now, I just think to myself that this is not really women's football, but rather the men's game masquerading as the women's game. I don't know, but what are your thoughts on this? Does the WSL and women's football in Western Europe have an identity crisis? Or actually, let's not bother with women's football in Western Europe, because we can come to that some other time. But let's just zero in on the WSL. Does the league have an identity crisis? And if so, what could be done to solve this? Because also, does anyone remember where, I think as recently as 2022, like, there was a third of the league that didn't have a Premier League sides. Like, we had the likes of Birmingham City, Reading, and Bristol City, all in top flight. Now it's just Premier League sides with women's sides in the top flight, and for me, I don't really like that. Also, one more thing, the WSL. Right now, the relegation fight looks interesting, but I've seen some fans call the one up, one down thing, which has been happening for quite some time now, quite boring. Like, how do you think the promotion relegation can be improved? I've seen some fans saying maybe there should be playoffs, but I'd like to know what you think.